My name is Terry Denard, a former news anchor and reporter in Birmingham. We are here today to document the oral histories of former District and Circuit Judge Sally Greenhaw and her late husband, the prolific writer and journalist Wayne Greenhaw. We are in the historic federal courtroom in Montgomery, where Judge Frank Johnson served and Judge Myron Thompson serves. Judges Thompson and Greenhaw also broke racial and gender barriers together in Alabama as Assistant Attorneys General in Bill Baxley's administration. I had the pleasure to work with Wayne as Assistant Tourism Director under Governor Folsom and developed a special friendship with the Greenhaws, so I am especially honored to be here today with Judge Greenhaw. Let's start at the beginning and tell us about the years growing up.
Well, I grew up in Luverne, Alabama. It's a small town located about 50 miles south of Montgomery, and most people knew it by the coffee pot because when they'd go to Florida, they'd stop there on the way. But it was a small town, a very rural area, and a very poor area. My family was better off than most of the people. We lived in town. When I say we lived in town, we had horses in the back, we had a huge garden, but we were still in town. And I grew up with going to segregated schools. I never really thought much about integration at that time. That's just how it was. Throughout growing up, one thing I learned, and I think it has followed me throughout, is that it was a poor county, and you never judge people about what their parents did or what they wore to school. Everybody was really equal, and you accepted everyone, and I think that's just something that stayed with me throughout.
What about your parents?
My parents were Julian and Amelia Maddox, and my mother basically was a housewife. She worked with my father in the early years, and we would take vacations. There's not a whole lot to do in Luverne, but in the summers, for instance, you would get on your bicycle or go ride a horse and no one cared or asked where you were going. You'd show up at meal times. There were no helicopter parents then. And in the summers, most summers, we would go on our vacation. My father was in the peanut business, and he grew, sold, and shelled peanuts, but there would be meetings. There was the Southeastern Peanut Association, which I might add President Carter and his brother Billy were part of. And in the summers, we would go either to Washington, D.C., Atlanta, or Miami to his meetings. It was really a nice growing up. In a small town, everybody knows what everybody does. So if you didn't do something you were supposed to do, everybody knew it, including your parents. So you led a pretty straight life.
And your sister was much younger.
She is. She's 9 years, almost 10 years younger, which in later life I've realized is really important because there was never any competition between us. And her being much younger and in good health, in my older years, that's important because I know she can take care of me.
And now you and Julia live very close to one another?
Yeah, I've moved from Montgomery, where I spent most of my adult life. After my husband died, Wayne, I didn't have family here, and the older you get, things can happen. So I decided to move to Birmingham to be near a family.
What about school? Did you like your studies?
I probably did as an early child, elementary. I really did not care for school. Probably I was bored looking back. I did okay in school. I made good grades, but I really did not care for school. I would often get in trouble because I like to read, and I would bring a book to read and try to read it under my desk and sometimes get in trouble on that.
Tell me, you mentioned that you went to the peanut association meetings for vacation, but sports was a big thing in your family?
My father was a real Alabama fan. He did not go to college, nor did my mother. But my father, back in the 30s, he took the train and out to see Alabama in the Rose Bowl for 2 years. The 2 years they were out there. So he, from way back, was an Alabama fan. And we would go to Alabama football games. At that time, they played a lot of them in Birmingham, and sometimes we'd spend the night, and the treat was going to Joy Young's. That was a Chinese restaurant, which was really exotic to me.
It was very good.
So we did go to ball games in Birmingham and Tuscaloosa. And then in if Alabama, after Bear Bryant got there, we usually went down to the Sugar Bowl or wherever they were playing.
Always by train?
We would get the train in Greenville and go down on the Hummingbird is what it was called, and go down to New Orleans.
What about college?
Well, I went off to school my first year. I went to Stevens in Missouri, and that's when I had an eye-opener. When I said I didn't like school, I'd never really studied in high school. It wasn't exactly a prep school. And when I got to college, I really did not make good grades that first year. And one of my professors called me in and asked me about my study habits, which I had none. And so he set up a program and really assisted me. I made much better grades that second semester, but you know, it was breaking a lot of old habits. So it took me a while to get on a real good track, but I finally did.
And then you went to Alabama.
I did. I started there, and I enjoyed some of my classes. I really did not enjoy college life that much. In some ways, I felt on the outside. I didn't enjoy sorority life. I met some friends, and my good friend from Luverne, Charlotte Turner, she was at the university at that time. She had gone also off to school, and we remained great friends throughout her life. And times were changing then too, and that's probably the first time race relations or integration really surfaced in my life where I thought about it. And of course things were happening in Alabama, and really a good friend of Charlotte's, and I later became friends, but the Selma Montgomery March, she went, and I mean, that was something I would not have considered, and but it really made an impression. I might add, my first year at Alabama, we were playing, I don't recall who we were playing in the Sugar Bowl, but my family and Charlotte's family, we went on the train down to the Sugar Bowl, and she was dating Bill Baxley at that time. So they were meeting up down in New Orleans, and they found a date for me off the street. Actually, he was a real nice guy. And so that's how I met Bill, but he also met my family. And he and my dad really hit it off, and they remained friends throughout my dad's life. My dad was a real big supporter of Bill from the very first. And Bill and I remained friends and still are. In fact, we will be celebrating our 60th anniversary this year, I guess in December. And so that's a friendship that started way back then that still, you know,
endures today.
We keep up.
Did you find some subjects that you liked better in those final years of college?
Yeah, I did. When I took the college board, surprisingly, I did real well in math, and I was shocked. And I actually thought, I wonder what that says if I'm doing so much better than other students. But I took math classes, I took biology, and I took a science course, but I did have classes I liked, but and I was doing well academically by that time. But I took Shakespeare, you know, I took the normal things. And then I graduated and realized I couldn't get a job. At that time, that would have been 1964, really women, they could teach or work in a bank as a teller. Now, I'm sure in larger places like Birmingham or Montgomery, they might have other outlets, but from Blue Vern, there wasn't, I didn't have contacts or have anything really I wanted to do. So I was visiting friends in Birmingham that summer or early June, and I had in the back of my mind, I'd sort of thought about law school. But I went out to Cumberland, and they were just starting classes, had not taken the LSAT, did not even know it existed, but they said, did I want to start school? And I said, sure. So I went to school all that summer and did okay, and then started again that fall, and then I did have to take the LSAT. And kids today would never do this, but I'm an Alabama fan, and Alabama had a football game that Saturday. They were giving the test, and I did take the morning part, but I left and went to the game and didn't finish it. But I thought, I'm already in school. I paid my money, and they aren't going to kick me out, and they didn't. So I can't say I did real well on the LSAT.
Do you remember if Alabama won the game?
I think they did.
As would be the case in many instances in your life, you found yourself one of the only or one of very few women.
When I started law school, there were 3 women in my class. One dropped out, actually married a fellow student. And then I think in the next year, a couple of women came in, mainly because their husbands had been transferred to Birmingham, and they left, but in a senior year, there were 3 of us graduating. And I really didn't think much about it. I think all the women were very well accepted, and by the faculty. The only time I felt singled out was in criminal law, and the professor, whenever there was a sex-related crime, they would always call on me. And that was just part of it. But that's the only teacher or incident that I remember being singled out.
What about the next steps? Did you have those planned in your mind?
Well, after I finished law school, I did not want to stay in Alabama. I sort of wanted to see the world. And a couple of my good friends, they both went to the New York area, but my friend Charlotte, she had married by then, and she was in D.C. and had worked on Capitol Hill. And I thought, well, I might want to try that. So I went up and stayed with her, and my congressman was Congressman Dickinson. And this will come out during the interview today, but I was a good Democrat then, and I still am. Congressman Dickinson was a Republican, but I went really to just pay my respects and maybe ask for some advice, but he offered me a job. So I accepted. It was not a very high-profile job. I really didn't have much contact with him, but I worked in D.C. for a couple of years. It was exciting times. This would have been the end of the about 1968 and 9, and Vietnam War was, really quite on the forefront. And I felt very strongly about it, but there were a lot of demonstrations in Washington, and I attended some. And then there was this really big march people from Hollywood, you know, Paul Newman. There were really a lot of stars there. And I mentioned to someone in my office that I wanted to march, or was planning to. And she said, you might want to say something to the congressman. So I went and I said, you know, I'm planning to march. And he said, I don't think that's a good idea. And I said, I really want to. And he said, I'm sorry, I just can't have anybody in my office doing that. And I don't remember, I will say, he didn't say, well, you're fired. But I think it was just a mutual thing. I'm going to do this. And I cleaned out my desk and left and marched. And was always glad I did. Then after that, of course, I didn't have a job. So I had some money saved. I've always been good at saving money.
There's that math ability.
And I decided I'd backpack and go to Europe. So I came home over the holidays, the Christmas holidays, and bought a Euro pass and flew Icelandic. It was the cheapest flight then. And spent about 4 months just going around Europe. I did have a cousin. Her husband was stationed there with JAG out of The Hague. He did some, and then I had another friend who was with the embassy in Spain. So I had a couple of people along the way that I could contact. But you know, this is way back. And I often think, but when I was raised to take care of myself, and I don't think my parents really worried unnecessarily. They thought I could take care of myself. And I think I was always taught to do that. And financially, that's one of the reasons probably I went to law school. There wasn't any marriage or something in sight, but I was always taught you better be able to take care of yourself. So I've always done that.
And then reality strikes. You decide you really do need to find a job.
Yeah, and so I come back home after I've been over there, and it was probably in late April or May, but my father we went on a family vacation to Miami that year. That's where the meeting was, and had really one of our best family vacations. When we first started out, we didn't have air conditioning in cars, and there was no place to stop. My mother would have to pack something, and we must have had a cooler, because I remember we usually had a ham in the car. But anyway, we had a nice family vacation and came back, and my mother wasn't feeling well, and she had a massive stroke. She would have been 51 at that time, and she survived, but she was in the hospital for quite a while. And then at that time, Warm Springs, Georgia, where FDR, they had a facility there for stroke victims. So she went and spent a few months there, but still, well, she had to have 24-hour help the rest of her life. She lived another 10 years. But that really changed whatever plans I might have had, because I was needed at home. And I wanted to be at home. My sister would have been starting her second year of college, and she certainly needed to do that. So that summer, and in the summers, I'd often worked for my father. I really liked to be in around what we call the peanut mill, particularly in the fall when farmers would bring in their products. And I mean, it was just an exciting time of the year. So I worked for my father that starting late that summer and throughout that fall. That fall was when Bill, and I refer to him most of the time as Baxley, was running for Attorney General. And he was running against an incumbent, and as I said, my dad was a real good supporter. And so we saw Bill a couple of times during that fall, but I worked during that fall for my father.
You knew at that time, through Charlotte and Bill, about the developments in civil rights and what his approach and desires for Alabama would be if elected.
At that time, and I sometimes look back and think, should I have done something different? But I didn't feel comfortable. There were very few people that it even came up with or that you were comfortable about talking about. Charlotte and I and some of her friends. And Bill, I do remember after the bombing, the church, 16th Avenue Church, he actually did keep the pictures of those 4 little girls in his wallet. And that was one of the, I think, made as much impression on me at that time as anything. And I remember, and I didn't do this, but Bill went to see Joan Baez, who was, part of the movement. She appeared at Spelman, I think. So I was jealous of that.
He told me this, but I don't think you knew that he always intended for you to be the first female assistant attorney general.
No, I did not. And at that time, I knew he was running for AG, but I had really not thought about what my future was going to be, but I knew it would be either local or, Montgomery. I would not be going out of state because of the family situation. So he was elected in November, and at some point he did offer me a job in Montgomery. And so I certainly accepted. Luverne is about 50 miles away. So during that he came in office in January, and probably for the first 4 or 5 months, I just commuted back and forth till we got everything settled with my mother. She at some point came home, but again, as I said, had to have 24-hour care. I remember the first day I reported for work, Don Dickard from Brundage, he had also been hired, and we met that first morning waiting outside the door to get in. We certainly wanted to be on time and were probably there too early, but the door didn't open till way after 8. So Don and I got to be good friends that morning. Later on, I've always gone to work early. That's when I do my best work. And at some point, I just finagled a key to the Attorney General's office, and so I could go in when I wanted to, and always got a good parking space.
So what was it like? Because this was an incumbent going out of office.
Yep.
Attorney General Baxley had expressed ideas about the first things he wanted to do. He's gone and hired a woman.
Yeah. He also hired a black during that time.
Judge Thompson. How were you guys received? I mean, what was your knowledge of those changes?
I really did not know any of the other attorneys he hired, but we all sort of knew who each other were. And we were all young and single. It was really exciting. The thing that came as a surprise to me, both Myron and I, none of the secretaries wanted to work for us. I was not as surprised with them feeling that way about Myron, but I was rather surprised that they felt that way about me too. But somebody had to do it, and I don't remember who worked for Myron, but the woman who worked for me, it was a very pleasant relationship, and I've always been good with typewriter, word processors, computers, so I could do a lot on my own.
Interesting. Your first case was a bit monumental in terms of...
I'm going to look around this courtroom.
It happened here.
It was in this very courtroom that I had my first case. Wayne, and we'll get more into him shortly. But I had known, and I always called him Judge, but we knew Frank and Ruth. We would visit at their home. They visited in ours. we got to know them, probably judges. When I say judge, I mean judge. That's who he was, Frank Johnson. But his best friend was probably Earl Pippin, and Earl and Louise Pippin were good friends of ours. So that's how we got to be in their company. And also Wayne had come in contact. Wayne worked for the Alabama Journal, which was the afternoon paper. He later worked for the Advertiser, but he had covered a lot of civil rights. And during that time, he also met Virginia and Clifford Durrs, who were good friends of the Johnsons and the Pippins, and they had been in Washington. Clifford really is the father of public television, and Virginia was really outspoken. Her sister married Justice Black. But anyway, it was Wayne met them. He was covering the Montgomery Civil March, and met the Durrs because everybody went there. Harry Belafonte, all of them were there. Right. And so he met them and remained friends with them. And it was a great, exciting time, not only because of the people in the Attorney General's office, but by this time I had met Wayne, and I was meeting the news people who were covering civil rights, which was going on in this courtroom.
And your case, your first case
here,
as an Assistant Attorney General was...
I had never had a trial before. And it was a habeas corpus. It's very unusual for a habeas corpus to get to trial. They just don't get very far. This was a state case, but they filed a federal habeas corpus. Probably the reason it got this far is his attorney was the renowned Solomon Say. And so was in awe of him. The case happened to arise out of Bill Baxley's jurisdiction when he was district attorney out of Dothan. So he was my star witness. So I was really, really nervous. I did get through it, and I'll say this for Judge, with young attorneys, and I saw this with others, if he saw you needed a little help, he would really get you in the right direction. Very subtly, but he did it. I won the case. It would have been hard to lose. But after that, everything seemed really easy, but it's really interesting to be back in this courtroom because this is really where I had my first trial.
That's neat. Did you get a sense with that Attorney General staff, because the 16th Street bombing case was being prosecuted with Bob Chambliss and an environmental team of lawyers that were world-renowned, and lots of things happening that were different for the state of Alabama, putting it on a different path. Did you get a sense, I mean, I know you said it was a great time to be there, but did you get a sense of how history-making it was at the time?
No, I probably didn't at the time. Now, like with the Chambliss case, I mean, there would be certain cases that were really big. I hate to say, one of the things we probably got the most publicity out of was in North Alabama. There was a speed trap, and Bill got a lot of letters from out-of-state people, and he sent attorneys from his office, and there was a trailer up there, and when people would be stopped and given a ticket, we would be there to give them legal advice. And so anyway, that got a lot of national publicity. But I don't think at the time you realize it. I know with certain cases you did. I was not really involved with the environmental, but you would see the publicity it got. It was, people were so excited and proud of the work that was being done. So it was one of the best times of my life, and most of us were young and single, And actually, it was Bill how Wayne and I met.
Yeah, at a parallel point, he
Yeah.
knew Wayne in another arena and thought you guys would make a nice couple.
He did. Wayne and Bill, met under real different circumstances than Bill and I did. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but one summer Wayne was working in Panama City at the Little Beeham as a bartender, and Bill came in and was one of the customers, and they got acquainted that way, and so formed a real good friendship, and stayed friends, of course, until Wayne died. And Wayne was godfather of one of Bill's children. You know, we've just always had good relationships throughout the years.
So how did you two come together, you and Wayne?
Well, there was a party, and there were attorney general people, but there was also, as I said, the paper was covering civil rights. So there was just a real array of people there, and Wayne was one. And one thing, the best part of college, I'll digress for just a moment.
Sure.
My senior year, the last semester, they had planned to have an exchange. Well, it was an exchange program. There was just going to be a group of people going to Mexico to teach in the American schools there. I didn't have a teacher's certificate, but I went to summer school the summer before my senior year and took enough education courses that I was qualified to go. So I spent about 3 months my senior year in college, which was the best part of college, in Mexico, and really developed a love for it.
So that love for Mexico will come back.
It will.
In your relationship with Wayne.
When Wayne and I met that night, we found out we both had been to Mexico. Wayne had scoliosis, and it was diagnosed probably when he was 11 or 12, and they did surgery a lot different back then, but he had to have major surgery. He was in Tuscaloosa, he and his family, at Children's Hospital here in Birmingham. And he was in a body cast from his neck down to, his thighs, and spent several months in the hospital, Children's, and then came home and was still in a cast for a while, but he missed a whole year of school. But during that time, he read a lot, and his mother really encouraged. He read adult books, but he came across a magazine when he was in the hospital, and it had this story about this school in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, which is in the mountains of Mexico. On the map, it would be between Mexico City and Monterrey. And it had this writing school. Wayne, from an early age, always wanted to be a writer. And we might get to this in a moment, but he had friends who were writers, well-known writers in Tuscaloosa, were known nationally and took writing courses. But while he was in the body cast, he had read about this school and asked his parents if he could, when he graduated from high school, he'd like to go down that summer. And of course they agreed. What are you going to say? Well, it became his senior year, and he said, I still am planning to go there, and he held them to it. So at that time, he got on a train in Tuscaloosa, and at that time, Mexico had passenger trains, and went all the way to San Miguel de Allende and went to the school there. They had never accepted anyone as young as Wayne. Most of the students were military who were down there getting their benefits, living a real good life on the GI Bill, and They met every afternoon at La Cucaracha. It's a world-renowned bar in San Miguel. So Wayne fell into some older relationships there.
With some pretty notable writers.
Yeah, but the deal was he had to come back and go to school, and he went to Alabama also. And but the next summer he went back, and one year he went back and went to Mexico City College. But you know, he loved Mexico, and that night we met, we started talking about Mexico, and he asked me out on a date, and I said yes. And then about a week later he called and broke it. I thought it was a good reason. At that time, Wayne had one novel that had been published, and this was his second book, a nonfiction about Lieutenant Calley. And he was on a tour for the book and had some television out in LA. But Alabama was also paying USC, which I think had something to do with it. But he broke it so he could do that, and I did think that was a good reason. He went to the game. Wayne had a knack of meeting people. The television program he was on, Allie McGraw happened to be on the same program. And I don't know if she and Steve McQueen were married, but they were together, and she asked him out to their house. So he went and met them, and I can't recall what book, but Wayne had a book later on, and Steve McQueen did an option on it. It was never filmed. In fact, I know they went over to Mississippi. That was where they were planning to film it, but it never came to fruition. But that was probably the first big money Wayne ever had, was that option.
Now, he was covering civil rights here in Montgomery for the newspaper.
Civil rights, and at that time, Montgomery was still very segregated except for the Albert Pick Hotel, and they had a restaurant and bar, and that's where people would meet. Chuck Morgan, of course, was here. Howell Raines was here often covering that, I remember. Howell, but they would all meet after court or after work, and I would sometimes after work go join them down there, and they'd meet at the bar at the Albert Pick. It was really an exciting time. There was so much going on, and right here in this courtroom. You
ended up getting engaged.
We did.
In order to take another step.
That's right. During that time, in the winter, it would have been in March, Wayne of 72, Wayne had applied for a Neiman Fellowship. That's a journal fellowship at Harvard. Ray Jenkins, who also worked at the paper, had been a Neiman Fellow and encouraged Wayne to do it. And at that time, I think there were either 14 or 16 Neimans. There were 2 foreign Neimans. One was from South Korea and one from South Africa, and the rest were from all over the states. But he went to D.C. for the interview and was accepted, and we did meet in New York to celebrate after that. And we were having drinks at P.J. Clark, another famous watering hole, and Wayne asked me to marry him, and so I did. We got married that fall of 72, and we got married in Baxley's office. It was a small civil wedding, and Chief Justice Howell Heflin, who was I knew mainly through the court system, but knew him, and Wayne had known him, and he married us. And then we had a reception after and left with a U-Haul to go to Cambridge. It was a great way to start a marriage. Really no responsibilities. I say no responsibilities. Neimans were required to to go to at least one course. They weren't graded, you were audited. Wives could also, or partners, could also audit courses, which I did. Wayne and a good friend, another Neiman from Mississippi, they both had taken a history course and had formed a real good relationship with the professor, and he asked them if they would like to teach a course there. So that spring, Wayne and the other Neiman, they taught a course, a civil rights course of Alabama and Mississippi. The first class, it was so crowded, not everyone could get in. They had to move it to one of the really big classrooms. It was always just packed. I think it was the Neiman Foundation who paid for them to have speakers come up. Bill Baxley was one, Chuck Morgan was one, Jay Cooper, Pierre Pelham, from Mississippi, Harding Carter, Delta Democrat Times was certainly one of the first newspapers to be recognized the problem with civil rights and on the forefront of reporting. But I think that was one of the things Wayne was most proud of and should have been. I mean, everybody was shocked about how well received it was.
Interesting. When you talked about how Wayne had a knack for meeting people, so many of those friendships lasted a lifetime, including one in which they shared a publisher or an editor at the time, and that's another relationship that you got to share in. That started with Wayne.
Wayne was real good at meeting people. I've never been. I'm not good at small talk, but Wayne just had a knack for meeting people and being comfortable with them and them comfortable with him. That's probably one of the reasons we ended up getting married. He made me feel that way. I say Nell, but Harper Lee, but none of her friends ever called her Harper. She was always Nell Lee. And she would come home to see her family in Monroeville every Christmas, but she always stopped in, I probably flew into Montgomery. And there was a bookstore downtown, Capitol Bookstore, and she knew the owners, Vic and Jean Levine, very well. And she'd always spend a couple of days here talking with them, buying books. And Vic called up Wayne and said, I have somebody here I want you to meet. So he went down and he and Nell met. I remember they went and had coffee somewhere after, and they were friends the rest of, well, she died before Wayne, but the rest of their lives. And she was really a fun person to be around. They kept in touch. And sometimes they'd write. Back then, you really didn't have computers. You had electric typewriters. And whenever we were in New York or Wayne, they would always get together. But they'd always see each other when she was in Montgomery. And they just later on, after, particularly Wayne always, when he worked, it didn't matter where, he got up early and he would work on whatever he was doing, a novel, a nonfiction. That's just what he did. And particularly after internet, or because they did a couple of times, he would have to send her manuscripts, mail them, and then back. She was a great editor. But, you know, later on it got much easier, and she still did that. She was really a great editor. Some of that might be, Wayne has all of his papers at AUM in Montgomery here, and I think some of that is in his papers.
And she did not like to speak in public.
No, she
but
did
he spoke
not.
For him, as I recall, several times.
I remember one incident. She was honored by Alabama Humanities. Wayne was on the board, and she would not have accepted if Wayne had not been the one to ask her to do it. But she made clear she wasn't going to give any kind of acceptance speech. But she did come up, and Wayne gave a nice acceptance speech, and Nell got up and said thank you and sat down. But everybody knew she was like that. They were just so proud that she was even there. She very rarely made public appearances. I know she was inducted into the Alabama Hall of Fame. She did go to that because I remember we went with her to that. But it was about the same thing. Thank you.
I remember Wayne pulled that speech out, those remarks he had made for her out of his pocket the next time he was in a tux, which was remarkable. How did they get to have the same editor?
When Wayne was in college, he took a writing course under Hudson Strode, who was really world renowned at that time. And he had an editor from New York come down and talk to the class. So a few years later, Wayne, and this would be back in the early, about 70, telephones. We had those then. Wayne telephoned this editor and said, I know you don't remember me, but I was in Hudson Strode's class, and you told us if any of us needed to ever call you about a book to do so, and I have a book I'd like to send you. I'm not sure she exactly said that, but anyway, she said, send the book. And so he did. And she ended up being his editor. She was also the editor of To Kill a Mockingbird. So that was something else he and Nell had in common with. And they both kept in touch with her over the years.
And in a remarkable cast of thousands that he knew in all different areas of work and such, Truman Capote came in.
Correct. Well, of course, he's from Monroeville, but Wayne knew him. They were doing, it was a TV production of a Thanksgiving Visitor here in Montgomery. And Frank Perry was the director, and Wayne was still, I think, at the Advertiser maybe by then. And Wayne had done movie reviews and book reviews, and so Frank Perry got in touch with him to do scouting for a location. And Wayne went all over, this is before I knew him, and found this place out in East Montgomery, Pike Road, which has grown a lot since then, but it was called the Marks House. I think it still is. And goats were living in it, but Wayne took pictures, and I mean, it was like, you know this is going to be it. And so Frank came down, and they decided this would be the home of where the Thanksgiving dinner is taking place. And so they really did up that house. I mean, it's still there, and it's now their community center. So they filmed that here, and Wayne would often be out there along with Truman. I say Truman, I never met him. Lee Ratzewell, Princess Ratzewell, came down for part of that, and it was an exciting time. Frank wrote in a cameo role for Wayne. He was called Cousin Wayne. The only thing is, it was, I don't know if it's a Model T, but it was one of those old cars, and Wayne couldn't drive it. He couldn't get it up the hill, so he had to have a stand-in.
A stunt driver early on.
And then he got, with filming, he got out of the car, and there Cousin Wayne was.
There was another interesting story in Wayne's background. He had done a lot of books and writings about George Wallace, made no secret of what he thought of his positions early on. And one of the folks who worked for George Wallace, who was, as I remember, very outwardly a Klan member, there was an interesting story that developed that Wayne broke on that as well.
Yeah, he did. Asa Carter, he is given credit for the famous line. He was George Wallace's speechwriter. Segregation now, segregation then, segregation forever. He really the way I understand it, had to more or less leave town. He was a Klansman, but he went out to Texas, and he was a good writer. He wrote a book, The Education of Little Tree, and it was later made into a movie, The Outlaw Josie Wales. Clint Eastwood did that movie. But during that time, some of Asa Carter's cronies who knew all about where he was and what he was doing called Wayne and said, you know, it's not Forrest Carter who wrote that book, it's Asa. And they gave him some information, and Wayne was able to confirm it, and so broke the story about it's Asa Carter, that Kluxer, who wrote this story. And it received national, what I remember about it, Wayne was in People magazine. I still have that, but my little dog at the time, he and Wayne were both in the picture for that.
Aww. Well, he really became the go-to writer if someone on a national level through the civil rights period and beyond, because
well, at that time, and probably he had met so many people because of the civil rights coverage here in Montgomery, they knew his name also. But at that time, like New York Times, Boston Globe, LA Times, any of those, they had, and Jack Nelson was also one of Wayne's good friends, and he worked for the LA Times. He was from Alabama. But they would have stringers here, and Wayne was a stringer. They didn't get a byline. All of the papers have changed that now. You get credit, but back then you got a little money, and you did the research and sent the story, and somebody else got the byline. But you know, he met a lot of people and kept friends that way.
Absolutely. So in 1982, you decide to make a change?
Yeah, Bill was no longer Attorney General, and another Attorney General had come in, and there'd been changes in the office, and some had left, and it just wasn't working out. So in the spring of '82, I decided it was time for me to leave. I did not think I would do well in a law office. I would not be good at keeping in charge with billable hours. I just never, that was. So I shared office with one attorney who had been in the Attorney General's office, and had started a practice. I had some business from the state, some departments I'd represented, but I can't say I had a great practice. But I decided that I might run for district court. There was an incumbent, and I really, thinking back, can't believe I did that, but I did. At the time, Bill was not running for office, and all of his friends in Montgomery, we'd always been active in campaigns, and all of a sudden we didn't have a campaign. So I decided to run for district judge. I thought the worst thing that can happen is I don't get elected, but my name's going to be out there, and I might get some clients. But all of really people who had worked in bills, and particularly Wayne, who had actually worked a short time in the Attorney General's office, but had always worked in Bill's campaigns, except that first time for Attorney General. He was working for the newspaper. But we just started out like we knew things. What made a real difference, and before I announced, when I was in the Attorney General's office, I had met people, and in the black community, I knew Joe Reed. I'd represented Joe Reed before. I knew Alvin Holmes. I'd represented Alvin before. I knew John Knight. So I knew who to go to in the black community. By being in the Attorney General's office on the civil side, I had met some prominent attorneys. I knew Jerry Beasley, I knew Charles Stakely, I knew Truman Hobbs, I knew Bobby Siegel, and I called them all up before I did it, and they said they'd support me. And probably the district judge, his father had been probate judge, and in any county, everybody knows who the probate judge is. They might not, and their divorce attorney, they judge. They know whoever they're divorced. But a lot of people don't really know who the judges are. And I think back, the incumbent didn't think I would, be a serious contender. But we did things a lot different than anybody had done in Montgomery. We did billboards, I did radio, I did TV ads, and I went door to door, my friends would. We really worked, and it paid off. There were 4 in the Democrat primary, and my good friend Alvin Holmes had told me, he said, now you aren't going to win without a runoff. You've got to have star quality. Said, now, I've got star quality, but don't worry if you don't win without a runoff. So Wayne and I, our buzzword, we were going to get star quality. And so I won without a runoff, and there was Republican opposition. And so I won, and did not even really think about it that I was the first woman to be elected judge in Montgomery County. It just, I had been one of the few in law school, I'd been one of the few in the Attorney General's office. It just didn't, it's not something I thought about. And the same thing when I ran for circuit judge. I'd already done a lot filling in for circuit judges. I'd already been doing a lot of circuit judge work. I liked it really better than district court. But I didn't think, I'd be the first until, after people, the news or something like ask. And
right.
So anyway, and running for circuit court, my good friend, Judge Phelps, he was retiring. He had not announced the retirement, but he had asked me if I would be interested in running, and I said I would. And he said, I'll let you know when I'm going to announce it. And that was a couple of months before. But during those months, and this would have been 1994, and things still were different back then with computers. And but I used Wayne's computer, and I had letters written up to every member of the Montgomery Bar announcing that I was running. I had personally, at that time, done stamps and done the envelopes. I had them ready to mail whenever Judge Phelps announced his retirement. And he did that day, and I put them in the mail that morning. And the next couple of days, attorneys called me to say they would support me. And I think it made a difference. I later learned a couple of attorneys that might have planned to run, but I did have a head start. In that regard, and it's always bothered me, the financing of judicial campaigns. Particularly the first one and that last one for circuit judge. Wayne and I were always the main donors. Judges could never personally ask for donations, right. But you had a committee, and they would often have a fundraiser, but I always just look at it as an investment. And that last time, I think you have to pay a fee, a filing fee, maybe a couple of thousand at that time. But I got unsolicited money at that time and got nice donations. And since I had no opposition, I was able to return it. And had a campaign fund not that much at the time, but when I retired, I was able to give it to some charities and churches. So, but that was something that still bothers me about judicial and Alabama elections. But I think, on the other hand, appointments can be just as political. And maybe they're behind the scenes, but it's still political. So anyway, that's how they're done.
You, in Montgomery, the courts are handled differently than in some other counties in Alabama. So that allowed you to cover
I did both
cases.
Civil and talking about circuit court, both civil and criminal. We have a separate family court, and I hate to say you couldn't have paid me to do family court. A couple of times I'd fill in, and to me that's the hardest job in the court system. And they also do divorces, and I had to do a few of those when they didn't have a judge or something, and that's not something I'd want to do. But we did both criminal and civil, and I always liked jury trials. I always thought I connected with the jury. I've never talked to another judge about this, but you know, attorneys will always say, I've got the jury, it's my jury. It was always my jury, the judge and the jury. I always felt like we connected, and I always felt like they were my jury.
In one of those cases, and I think death penalty is probably something that's incredibly difficult for any judge, but talk to me about one of those cases and how you felt about that.
Well, before I decided to run for circuit judge, I really had to think about it, because that's something that you're going to have a case before you. Could I impose the death penalty? And I may not be right about the case, but I think it was the Oklahoma bombing had occurred at some point in there. And, you know, children had been killed. And I thought there are circumstances, if the facts and the law support it, where I probably could. But I really gave it some thought. And I'm very fortunate. I never had to face that. The first capital murder case I had, I'd only been on the bench on circuit court about a month, and I remember two of the jurors were from First Baptist Church, which I thought was odd to have two people from the same workplace, and I sort of thought, uh-oh. But as it turned out, during the trial, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but I think most judges do this, you're hearing the same evidence, and I kept thinking, something is wrong here. And I'm thinking, what if they come back with a guilty and then a recommendation of the death penalty? It was something really bothering me about the case. But anyway, we get through, I charged the jury, and they're really out a long time. They never asked for any additional charges, and they came back, and I always gave the jury the choice of the foreman reading the jury, the verdict, or if I did, and they wanted me to, and I looked and it said not guilty. I mean, I probably breathed a sigh of relief. And there was also a note, I finished whatever you do to wind up the case, but there had also been a note if they could meet with me at the conclusion. So they went back to the jury room, and I, went back, and there was some really crying. It was a very emotional time, but they said, the facts just didn't support it. And I said, that's exactly what I was thinking. Throughout every jury trial I had, there may have been less than 10. I was always so proud that 12 strangers who've never met each other, except for that case, could come to the same conclusion and reach what I thought was the correct verdict. And I still just think that is wonderful thing about our court system.
In one of your early cases, right now you had kind of seen it, maybe not directed at you, but from a security standpoint, there had been some threats certainly directed at Baxley and the staff there. And one of your first cases, there was an issue of, or at least it was perceived as an issue of safety.
Probably one of the cases that received the most publicity, and it was probably the first month. I had a lot, though. I'd been district judge. At that time, we were in the old courthouse, and district court had 2 really small courtrooms. And in addition, the county jail wasn't big enough to hold the inmates. So most of the county inmates were at the city jail. So twice a week as district court, when someone's incarcerated, you have them brought out and you tell them what the charge is and what their bond is, and to be sure they have attorneys. We would go over to the city to do it. So we always had a deputy to take us over. We had a deputy assigned to us anyway. And often there were 2 deputies along. Because of paperwork, the other deputy wasn't with me in the courtroom. They would be doing administrative things. But the Todd Road, and I don't remember all the incidents, but there were families from mainly the Detroit area, and they had come down for a family reunion. And there had been a phone call about something happening out at Todd Road, and 2 undercover, I know they weren't in uniform, policemen, I don't know if it's because they were the near ones, but they went out to see what was happening. And I don't know, and I don't know if we'll ever know quite what happens, but they go in and there are weapons, and both officers are shot, but there were a lot of questions about why they were even there, how they entered. I mean, I don't know, but 2 officers were shot and several people were charged with felonies. So that was on the docket that day. And actually they had attorneys, but before that, I'd mentioned about the district court offices, and the sheriff's office was right across the hall. I mean, you could almost hear each other. But before I went to court that day, Jimmy Evans was DA and Maxim Butler was sheriff. And they were out in the hall, and I mean, anybody could hear them. It wasn't a quiet conversation. I heard Maxim Butler say that Morris Dees had called him, and Morris was willing to put up his property. He still had a lot of property out in the country, and for bond for all of them, and that Maxim had said that he would agree to do that, and Jimmy was saying, well, that's fine. And so I maybe shouldn't have, but I heard that conversation. It never dawned on me that the bond I set would be an issue. But I got over there, told them that, and I don't remember what the charges were, but say that the bond would be recommended from $2,000 to $10,000, and I probably set the bond like at $5,000. Now some of them had several charges, so it might be $15,000 total, and you had several people, so it added up, but it never dawned on me that they would be released from jail that day. But they weren't, and there were some rallies that night, but how people see things different. As I mentioned, we usually went over with 1 or 2 deputies. We went in the back door of the municipal court, where a policeman always had to be there to let us in and out. So in the newspaper that next day, there was me with 2 deputies and a policeman, and talking about how they had to call and get security for me. And so, that was just how a photographer or someone saw something that day that was really not unusual.
One of the other cases you were involved in was the long-running school equity funding case in Alabama. And while you weren't involved, in the actual case, it kind of came at the end of a long case that never really materialized.
Well, I never had the original case. Judge Reese did, but he had to recuse himself. So when I got the case, it had been up on appeal to the Alabama Supreme Court, and they had affirmed it, and it had come back, and it was before me on attorney's fees. And it was really a lengthy hearing. I remember Bo Torbett, Bobby Siegel. There were a couple of other attorneys who were involved. But we had a hearing, and it took me quite a while to come up with the order. And I awarded, I remember, it was over $3 million in attorney's fees. I mean, this case had gone on quite some time. It was well deserved, and it was affirmed by the Supreme Court. So attorney's fees were paid, and then a couple of years later, I think there was someone new in the Attorney General's office. There were new people also on the Supreme Court, but it came before me on a question of jurisdiction. And I wrote an order, and I mean, there were hearings, but I basically said I had jurisdiction over it. It'd been affirmed. Well, it came back that I didn't have jurisdiction over it, which was one of the surprises I had as far as being affirmed or reversed. But again, there were different judges too by that time. Right. So that was unfortunately the end of the case. Our education system, I hate to say, is no better. It might be worse.
And so it never developed.
That's a disappointment.
There was another case that made, there's an interesting connection we'll get to in a minute, but that made headlines around the world.
Which again surprised me. And I only had a couple of lines in there.
And this involved a former governor who was convicted. Again, you didn't preside over the case, but the tail end of that.
I think Randy Thomas had Judge Guy Hunt's case, and he was convicted at some point. Again, he might have recused, but Guy Hunt was on probation, and I had that. And at that time, this was circuit court, I had a restitution docket. I usually did about once every month, and different people could be on, but I just found it a good way to keep track of what monies were being paid, so somebody doesn't get so far behind, or if something's come up, you might give them more time. Well, that day, and I'd not paid any attention who was on the restitution docket. Of course, the minute I walked in the courtroom and saw Guy Hunt and my good friend and Guy Hunt's attorney, George Beck, and all the press I knew. And so they were asking for his probation to be terminated. And in order to do that, he had to pay all of his court-ordered monies, which was over $200,000 at that time. So they had witnesses and telling what a great job Guy Hunt had done up in Coleman, how many people he had gotten jobs, he had just, done all these things in the community, and just how many people, but mainly they kept talking about how many jobs he had got people. And I couldn't help it. I just blurted out, well, why couldn't you get a job? And so that was what was carried. Why didn't you get a job? And by the end of that day, those monies were paid in full by someone Guy Hunt had appointed to the Court of Criminal Appeals. So I might still, it's even now, be the best circuit court ever judge for collecting restitution.
Fees. What was it about being on the, when did you change your mind? I mean, when you decided to leave the bench, you made that decision?
Okay. Well, I came on the bench in January of '83, and it takes its toll. Things in the court system had changed over that time. When I started out, probably because most attorneys really knew each other in Montgomery, they called each other, they worked out things. It got where it was not that way. It became a paper mill in a lot of ways. Attorneys just filing motion after motion, not trying to work things out. You would just have to have all these hearings on motions. I mean, your desk would be stacked up with them. Also, I think attorneys' conduct changed. They were often rude to each other. They were rude to witnesses. They were loud. For some reason, they thought the louder they were, the bigger impression they were making. And sometimes I thought they were rude to me, and more than once have threatened to find someone in contempt. It was just a change, and also the type of court cases. One thing, and I'm going to say before I get that, and people might be surprised, the easiest cases to try were the medical malpractice. There were probably 5 or 6 firms plaintiff, 5 or 6 firms defense, and this is throughout Alabama. Basically, they handled all of the medical malpractice. Those attorneys knew each other. They would exchange stuff. If they came to you with a problem, it was so rare. They just wanted to get their case ready for trial, and they really would try to settle them. If they couldn't settle them, those cases moved the best of any. You didn't just have all these useless objections. If they made an objection, they had the reasons and they had the response. It just went very smoothly. And so that's how cases can be handled. But they stopped being that way. And also, I think on the criminal side, at that time, and the law in Alabama has changed, but at that time I think it was 14 where you could have a juvenile charged with capital murder. They would have to be certified, and that's changed. And all the law as far as sentencing and juveniles and capital murder has changed since then. But at that time, and I remember you could, sometimes I had to almost stand up. You would have a 15-year-old charged with this horrid crime. And you think, my goodness, what has happened? And the crime seemed to get more brutal. On the criminal side, I rarely saw a father in the courtroom. If you did, you almost had some hope that maybe if there was probation or something, there might be some involvement. You didn't see that many mothers, you saw grandmothers. And that just was so sad to me.
And it took a toll.
So anyway, I guess it just finally wears on you. And I mentioned I'm a good Democrat. Don Siegelman was leaving office, and I knew I either had to stay the rest of my term or I decided it's time for me to leave. I shouldn't say this, but you have a calendar on your desk, and I came eligible to retire with full benefits that October. And I'd look at that calendar and I would think, how many days before I became, how many days do I have before I can retire? And I thought, that's what they do in prison. They start counting how many days till their time is up. So I thought, it's time for me to go. And So I decided to retire so Siegelman could name my successor, and he named Truman Hobbs Jr.
You also got
which was important to me because I didn't know him as well, but I knew his father from the Attorney General's office, and we had a good friendship.
You also got to teach something, going back to this, at least to give back in this regard.
I guess my farewell in the judicial system, attorneys have to take continuing education, and so they all do it at the very end, November and December. And judges are often, we would do a seminar. And my last one was Courtroom Manners. And so I taught about how courtrooms is just not functioning the way they should be, how they are rude to each other. And of course I had handouts, and I had some, didn't mention names, but I thought, I hope somebody pays attention to this, and I thought I should have called the law schools. They need to do more in that regard.
So you were involved on the bench at the time Wayne was writing 22 books in all.
Yeah.
But then he took on another role. How did that come about?
Okay. Well, right after I was elected circuit judge, Guy Hunt had to resign, and Jim Folsom, lieutenant governor, became a governor. And Wayne and Jim didn't know each other. Wayne knew, and I knew both Marcia better probably than Jim, but Governor Folsom asked Wayne to be tourism director, and of course he accepted. Wayne he had written about Alabama. He really loved Alabama and knew as much about Alabama as anybody I know. And then at the same time, Governor Folsom appointed you as assistant. So that's how Wayne and I became friends with you, and remained good friends. You and Wayne did until he died. And I know while y'all were there, tourism really got national awards, and you probably know more about that than I do. Wayne would tell me, oh, we did this and that, but I don't remember the specifics. You could help me out there.
Well, Stars Fell on Alabama was the advertising campaign that Wayne always had, I think, in his mind, and you guys were always big travelers, so it was an area that he loved, and those advertising campaigns on the Olympics and Stars Fell on Alabama were the first of Alabama's tourism and travel awards nationally, and so it was a great recognition, and Wayne was, as you might imagine, incredibly popular on the Travel and Tourism State Director Tour. And then there was one other huge announcement that impacted Alabama, and you were a part of that with Wayne, which was the Mercedes announcement.
Well, Wayne had been been appointed tourism director, and at that time, and I may not have the title correctly, but the southeastern states, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, South Carolina, but we all had an alliance with Southeastern Asia. And we actually they formed they hired an office that represented the southeastern states there. And Wayne was called into Governor Folsom's office, and he said, I'm not going to be able to go. And this was something, I think most governors always went to. And he said, I'm going to ask you to go in my place. And he said, I can't go into the reasons, but there's going to be a big announcement, and just don't say anything. Well, you really didn't need to say anything. So we went. I, of course, paid my own way, but we went over there, and that night they had a reception for the governors, and Wayne and I were there. And I remember Carroll Campbell was the governor of South Carolina, and when Wayne introduced himself, he said, y'all got Mercedes. because South Carolina was in the bid, and Wayne didn't know what to say and just smiled. And that very night on CNN, I mean, it was the major story, Alabama getting the Mercedes.
It was an exciting time. I also want to go back a little bit to Mexico, because after you retired, some years later, you guys spent more time there.
Well, after I retired, we decided to rent a house in San Miguel de Allende, and we did, and for a couple of weeks, and we decided we might really want to buy a house there and spend some time there. And so I went back that April after I retired and rented a place for a month. And Wayne came down toward the end of that, and I looked at some houses, and we'd found one, and we decided to buy it. And it was really, and looking back, I'm so glad we had that time, because as much as I loved Mexico, Wayne loved it more. But we bought the house, and we would basically spend the summers and the winters down there. And we, in some ways, had two sets of friends. People from the South, particularly Texas, would come in the summer because of the heat, and then our northern friends would come in the summer and the winter because of the cold. But we bought a house, we rented it some. But even there, Wayne, every morning he got up, he had an office, and by that time you had internet, you could do, we could make phone calls, you know, it was just a lot different. So he could stay in touch, you could be on board, you know, you could just be present. So we did that, and actually his last two books, and I brought one here just in case a book came up and I needed to refer to it, but his last two books are what I call the civil rights books. But he was able to work on them, research, and but we would also come back, you know, and he would continue that. But it was a great time of our life. There are a lot of foreigners in San Miguel, international people. I took Spanish. I could read and write fairly well, but my southern accent and Spanish just don't mesh. And unfortunately in San Miguel, because of so many foreigners, you really didn't need Spanish.
Looking back, the remarkable coupling of you and Wayne, but also the mainstay of Bill Baxley in your lives.
Yeah.
Can you reflect, you both in your own right are so remarkable, but together that group and his involvement?
Bill has been a constant in our lives. Wayne died in 2010, and he spoke at Wayne's funeral. I'm going to digress for just a moment. I'm going to go back to campaigning. When I said, you know, going door to door, one of the things campaigning, at least in Montgomery, and that I enjoyed the most is going to black churches. And I still did that. I did that during campaign, but would do it periodically through the year. And there were a couple of black ministers I really had a good relationship, and one died recently, but he was the minister at Wayne's funeral, Baxter Morris, and he was minister at First Baptist, what they call Brick-a-Day. And back in slavery times, slaves working on buildings, they would try to save a brick every day, and on Sundays bring one, and that's what built that church, was the bricks they saved from places they were working. And it's right across from the municipal building. It's a small church, and they had what they call the men's choir. It's probably less than 10 could be in it, but there was a man who had a beautiful voice and could play the piano, and I had him also at Wayne's funeral. So going back, Bill and I kept up our friendship. We still talk often. We've actually probably talked more often during COVID, maybe out of boredom, but we often found we were reading the same books, and I've just always treasured Bill's friendship, and Wayne did too. Bill is probably, I think most people would say this, the best friend I know about keeping up with friends. If he hasn't heard from you in a while, he calls you up. He does that with everybody. And I think people need to remember, and unfortunately, I don't think things are this way now. One time I was talking to Bill, and he and Jerry Beasley ran against each other. They are friends now. Jerry, when Bill was honored a couple of years ago, Jerry was one of the people, putting it together. They talk on the phone. Unfortunately, it seems to me now, things are so divided, you don't see that crossover, and I think that's unfortunate.
In this day and age of what you say about the division, how would Wayne be handling that now?
He would be handling it better than I do. I really get depressed about it. I worry about it. I wonder what I can do, and I really haven't come up with a good solution. But Wayne, he would still be writing. He would be interested. He'd probably be covering things. He would have an outlet. He might be writing a book about it. I think he would deal better with it than I do. And he'd be talking to people on both sides, and he'd be listening.
Judge, I want to thank you for letting me be with you today and sharing with us.
Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed it, and I will see you soon. I hope we had talked about after this, and just to note, we're planning to have a follow-up maybe with Judge Thompson and Bill Baxley, and we're going to talk more about Wayne and Lucy Baxley. And Lucy has been was a part of our lives just as well. So I hope to see everybody soon.
Thanks.